with the purpose of doing it for Facebook, YouTube, to help people, to give them access on how do you, if you're a new speaker, actually overcome the fear. So I'm going to share with you the 3 things I've learned, and I appreciate your feedback. The single most effective way is simply this: acknowledge your fear. To simply say, you know, I am nervous, but this is what I'm going to talk about. In Toastmasters, I'm going to say right now, they tell you not to do that because it makes you look weak, it takes away your power. So I'm simply going to give 2 responses to that. The first is this: nobody says it doesn't work. Because acknowledging your fear is a very common thing. We do it in all phases of life. Imagine a soldier going out to the first battle, and he says to his commanding officer, you know, I'm afraid of dying. And the officer says, no, don't say that, you look weak. Of course. So just to acknowledge it is to say, this is what I feel, but I'm going to do it anyway. So here's the point about this. It's a good, effective technique in certain situations, and choosing the right one is critical. I had a young man many years ago who was in the 12-step program, and he was going to be leading the meeting that night for the first time, and he was petrified. He said, you know, I've never stood in front of a group before. I don't know what to do. So I gave him the simple advice. I said, just stand up, look at him and say, this is my first time, and I'm really nervous. And then go ahead and start talking. So a couple days later, I asked him, so how did it go? He said, you know, after I told him I was nervous, I wasn't nervous anymore. See, and that's the whole point. Now, there's an ineffective way, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But I remember another situation. I was talking to a woman who was leading a program with young people, and these were the higher achievers in the school, and they had a little Toastmaster 10-week program set up. And one of the young girls, she was in 8th grade, had volunteered for this program, but for 2 meetings in a row, she wouldn't say a word. And they were concerned because she wasn't getting the benefit of standing up in front of the group. So I made this recommendation. I said, just go up to her and say, now, when it's your turn, you don't have to talk. But would you mind just standing up and saying, I just don't want to talk? And that's what they did. So, interesting enough, they shared with me afterwards. They asked her, will you stand up and just say you don't want to talk? And she said, yeah. So when it came to her time, she talked for 5 minutes about something that she was just really excited about. So the whole point about acknowledging our fear is that once we look at it, it tends to dissolve. So I found this to be the single most effective way. However, there are situations where it's not appropriate, right? Think audiences or events, whatever, where you just don't feel comfortable. So this is the second most effective way. To understand it, we have to understand that there are 3 types of knowledge. And all knowledge, everything in our head that we consider knowledge, is what we use that runs our life. Everything we think, say, or do is related to what we know. Do you agree with that? But what we know has 3 different categories. The first is what I would call observable. You know, we know it's real. We know the sun's going to rise at a certain time tomorrow morning. No question, because we can observe it every year at this time. And basically we think of it as scientific or measurable, but it's observable, it's real. The second type of knowledge is experiential. It's things we experience. For example, he talked about the trigger points. So I know if I say to my wife, why did you do that? I'm going to get a very definite response. I know this. You see, it's part of my knowledge that I use for running my life. And so there are various things that we experience and we know it. And the third category is really the most important, and it's what we believe is the truth. For example, when I was a little boy of 4 years old, I said something and some boys laughed. And I said, I'm stupid. And that became, for years, the knowledge about me that ran my life. So about 12, 13 years ago, Marty Lefko, who runs, can't think of the name of the institute, it's a personal growth thing, gave a speech at Toastmasters at our district conference. And he talked about the power of belief when we stand in front of a group. If we are afraid of standing in front of a group, he said, we have beliefs in the background that tell us what the world is like, and it's not true, but we believe it is. And so much has been said over the last 50, 60 years. I don't want to dwell on it, but what I want to give you is a very powerful technique to deal with any belief, really, but the belief about speaking in front of a group. So we're afraid something's going to happen. So here it is, 3 simple steps. First is, what are we afraid of? The best thing is to write it down. The other thing is you can stand in front of a mirror, because the person you talk to in front of the mirror is going to know the truth. And it's pretty hard to lie to that person in the mirror. So whatever you're afraid, are you afraid of what you're going to look like, what's going to happen? What are some of the things we have? Let me ask you, what are some of the fears we have about speaking in public for the first time? Go ahead, shoot it out.
Confidence.
Well, what is the fear? That, in other words, what is
Being humiliated.
To feel humiliated, okay?
Rejected.
Make mistakes.
Not speak clearly.
I won't be clearly. People will think something negative about me. Anything else?
You're gonna
Fall
die.
asleep while I'm talking.
I'll bore them. Okay. So these are great. Those are the kind of fears we have. So if you're speaking for the first time, write down every single thing that you're afraid is going to happen. Then, look at yourself and say, how am I different from all the people who stand up and talk and those things don't happen? Why am I more boring than the other person I listened to the other day? Why am I going to be humiliated? So what is there about me that's humiliatable? I like that word. What is there about me that would cause people to laugh and really be honest, that's different from anybody else? I did this for a different program once, and an amazing thing happens when we look at this. What is it when you compare yourself with other people? Really, honestly, compare them. Are they worse? Are you worse than them? I mean, somebody might be a more accomplished speaker, but you have to be an accomplished speaker to stand in front of a group and talk. How about all the people who talk every day? How about standing in front of people at work and people in your office? Do they laugh at you? So what we do in this very simple process is you write down your belief, you write down why you're different than everybody else, you write down why this situation is going to be worse than any other situation. And then you read it to yourself. You read it over, you read it over, and something begins to happen. That belief dissolves. Any questions?
So far, so good.
What do you think?
I think it's great.
Okay, so that's the second. Now the third most effective way of overcoming if you're speaking is for people. Yes, ma'am.
So number 2, I just summed it up. Write down the worst case scenario.
Well, that's a good point. Let me clarify that.
Okay.
Write down your belief in detail as to why you're different than everybody else. And then repeat it over and over to yourself. But it's to examine the belief. And there's other ways. There are so many different ways that you could do a whole long presentation on. Because I remember the first book I read about belief and the power of belief, I was a teenager, and I think it had been written in the 40s. And it's still around today. So it's been around a long time. We know that beliefs are what run our life. Okay, so the third most effective way. This occurs for people who have been speaking, but they get in a situation where they're speaking to an audience that is more intimidating. Maybe it's experts in a certain field or people with power, responsibility. It's an audience that is different than their normal audience. Or it's on a subject they haven't spoken before. And so there's this fear that comes up. And have any of you ever had that situation? You have? I mean, I have. I think of if I had ever been invited to speak at a district conference, what that would be like. Or what if you were asked to speak at an international conference? So all of a sudden, you feel comfortable as I'm an accomplished speaker, but going to a higher level, boy, I can really activate all of those fear glands. So I've developed a couple of approaches that I find are effective. It doesn't mean you won't get the jitters, and you want those to a degree, right? Because you want that blood flowing. That's what gets you energetic and activated and makes it interesting to listen to you. But there are things you can do to help make you confident, and that's really what we're striving for. So the first thing is to use, the first suggestion, is to use the first principle, which is to acknowledge it. But now, to acknowledge it in a way that leads into your presentation. And I'll give you an example. I've seen people who come to Toastmasters District Conference. And they're successful people, but Toastmasters, they're the people who look at you and analyze your speaking. And I've heard people at district conferences say, well, you're probably going to hear every mistake I make, and they'll be apologetic because they're not, whatever. They look weak, they look foolish. So let me give you a suggestion how you could acknowledge it and still hold your power. So if you were speaking, and there's different ways, so just as one suggestion. If I was speaking at a Toastmaster conference and I was coming from outside of Toastmasters, I might say something like this. If I was really nervous about them picking me apart, because that's the fear, right? You're going to analyze me, and I'm going to feel stupid, embarrassed, foolish. So this is one way we can acknowledge it and still move on. When I was invited to speak to the Toastmaster conference, my first reaction was, oh boy, these people are going to really pick me apart because I'm not a professional speaker. But then I realized the reason you invited me is because people who know my passion for what I do feel that what I have to say can make a difference. And so I want to take this opportunity to share with you something that's been really important to me. Did I lose my power? No. Okay. But what I did, though, and this is the third technique, is I took the emphasis off of the messenger and I put it on the message. So what I have shared with people who have been in this situation is if you're talking to a group that you're nervous about, instead of focusing on what am I going to say to you, what am I going to look at? How am I going to come across? We take the emphasis off of me and instead we put it on the audience. So we have to answer a couple of questions. First is, what is my audience going to get out of my message? And I get that firmly embraced in my mind. And I do that with just every audience because I really want it to be about the message. So what is the audience going to get? What are you going to get out of my message? Not much today because it's not appropriate to you. But for an audience of first-time or relatively new speakers, it would have more relevance. So that's the first question. What's my audience? What's the impact going to be? How's it going to affect their life? Why is it worth them listening to this message? The second question is, why am I qualified to give? Why can I stand up here and with confidence share this message? So by answering those two questions and focusing on what the audience is going to get, takes the pressure off of me. Now, this isn't, I want to just clarify one thing. I never want you to think that I'm going to say you can stand up here and have fear. What I am saying is that the fear doesn't have to stop us. And that's the whole goal. So if we can move through and speak in spite of our fear, we can take what we learn, take the mistakes, grow from it, and eventually reach whatever level we choose to reach. So the three best principles for overcoming the fear of speaking: one is acknowledge it. Two, examine and dispel your beliefs. And third, focus on the message over the message. Mr. Toastman.